the familiar premise of sexually active suburban teens being picked off one by one, to the characters within the film watching monster movies, David Robert Mitchell's It Follows is conscious of its own place relative to the slashers that came before it. Even the film's title implies a linear next step, the sequel to its predecessors. But It Follows departs from its forerunners in several ways. Namely, that the terrible place, defined by Carol Clover as a place of refuge turned claustrophobic death trap, has expanded outwards into space itself. The threat, too, is diffused. No longer a single masked killer, it's a shape-shifting, inhuman entity. I argue that Mitchell decentralizes the site and source of horror in order to convey a sense of fatalism in that the characters in the diegesis are subject to inescapable external forces and have very few choices of recourse in the face of this systemic threat. This fatalism is of course experienced by the characters in the form of it, but it is made tangible for spectators by unrelenting camera movement. I want to focus specifically on the classroom scene, wherein Jay sees it for the first time by herself. The scene begins the same way the movie does, with a slow 360-degree pan around an everyday environment. But having established early on that seemingly empty space is the source of danger, the circling camera generates anxiety. We pause on Jay, watching her as she watches out the window. Using an eyeline match, we see it at the same time Jay does. The woman is framed between window panes, and as the camera cuts back and forth between her and Jay, it slowly zooms into each. The scene began with only the sound of the professor reciting a poem, but as the camera continues to press inward, tense, non-diegetic music swells and, as is stated in the poem, forces the moment to its crisis. As Jay leaves the class, the camera completes its now familiar circular motion and hovers over her shoulder as she turns the corner. The scene continues its incessant progress down the hall, and as Jay turns and sees it closing in on her, she stops in shock while the camera continues its advance, resulting in an abrupt close-up on her face, which then cuts to a canted angle of it in a 3/4 shot and getting ever closer. Even after this sequence ends and the imminent danger is gone, the frenetic momentum doesn't let up. The horror of an empty vista evidenced once again by a shot of the world opening up as Jay drives her car out of a tunnel. This ceaseless movement serves to remind the viewer that the threat is external and stems from the environment itself, and therefore, as much as Jay and her friends change location, and as incessantly as the camera moves us through the diegesis, there is no getting outside the system. This is echoed narratively by the motifs of cars and driving. Ben Dalton states that the film cruelly reimagines the road movie, not as escape route, but as inescapable route. Over and over, we see shots of long streets ending in vanishing points, and again this is reiterated in the film's content. Lamentations on growing up, overgrown and abandoned cityscapes, and most conspicuously, Yara's character reading from The Idiot. The characters' fates seem to be determined externally, by an unseen but present set of rules, rendering their retaliations against the system impotent, and the viewer is left with a sense of entrapment and inevitability, despite and almost because of the constantly moving camera. So, even with its retro aesthetic, it follows this pessimism towards progress and emphasis on ecstasy, makes it a postmodern slasher.